Hello, my name is Ofer Zwikael, and together with my colleagues Ossi, Joe, and Martina, we have written this editorial on quantitative papers that has just been published in the International Journal of Project Management. In the next few minutes, I would like to take you through some advice on publishing quantitative papers in project management journals. The background is that we have more and more papers, quantitative papers, in project management. Many of them use surveys as a methodology for the research. In many cases, the research that has been done is very good, but there is lack of clarity in the paper itself about what has been done exactly. And this sometimes prevents from reviewers and editors to actually understand what has been done and what actually the research has covered. The objective here is to clarify some reporting expectations, not about how you do the research, because we assume that you do good research, but how to present it better and communicate it better in your papers. I will go through a few areas of interest. The first one is the issue of population and sample. First of all, you have to discuss and agree what's the population that you are targeting in this paper. Are you studying, for example, IT project in Australia, or IT project overall, or any type of project that you want to study? Once you know what the population is, then obviously you want to sample a project from this particular population. So in a sample, we may have 100 or 200 projects that should represent IT projects in Australia. We have to first understand and convince the reader that this sample represents the population. So we have to understand the population better. For example, take data from some other sources about the distribution of IT project in Australia according to type of project, type of IT project, and then make your samples so that it represents the same distribution of a project. And write it and explain it in the methodology section. Make sure that you have enough sample size to represent the population. And we have one rule of thumb in the editorial, but there are many other suggestions that you can find in the research methodology literature. And finally, when you go to the discussion section of the paper, you need to generalize. And then you have to ask yourself, have the finding that we have in the paper, our results, can they be generalized to all projects, to all IT project, or only to IT project in Australia? And again, be very careful about generalizing when you don't have the evidence that this may work also in other type of project, other industries, or other countries. A very important area in quantitative research is the measurement. Be clear about the measure, the construct that you use and how you measured it. For example, we used a 7-point Likert scale. Where did you take the item from? Did you develop them yourself? Did you take them from another paper? Which one? Have you adjusted the items to fit your context, or did you just use the same items exactly as they were published in a previous paper? The items of the survey should be reported at some stage during the paper. Make sure that you have multi-item measures for each construct. Usually, we don't want to have only one item to measure a construct. If you have only 2 items, you may need to justify this selection. Make sure that you don't have a common method bias, especially when independent and dependent variables are assessed by the same person. If so, there are a few techniques to deal with this bias, but make sure that you don't just ignore this, but actually treat this issue appropriately. And finally, reliability and validity of each measure should be taken into account and reported. There are a few very clear and common techniques about reliability and validity, but make sure that in your paper you have a subsection that actually tells us that you have tested the reliability and validity of the measure and they have been found reliable and valid before you actually go to tell us about your results. Another important area are the sources of quantitative data. Tell us exactly your unit of analysis. Don't ignore this issue. Tell us what you are studying as the unit of analysis. This can be the organization level or project proposal or a team member in a project, but what is the unit of analysis? Then sometimes you can't get to the observation as you would like for the unit of analysis, and you need to use some proxies. For example, in one of recent papers that we tried to evaluate the success of projects. One of the measures would be customer satisfaction. The company that we worked with was very useful and friendly, but they couldn't let us have any access to their clients. So we had to use a proxy for this particular measure instead, and we reported that we used a senior manager from the company that worked with the client to report on customer satisfaction as a proxy. Of course, it's a limitation, but this has been made clear. Hypotheses are another major part of each quantitative paper, which suggests that all hypotheses are clearly justified, including the direction, where do we expect them to go, and try to make the paper more interesting by having non-trivial hypotheses. For example, adding mediating effects or moderating effects to the paper to make it a bit more interesting and more relevant to different scenarios, different contexts, different cases, where not all theories will work exactly the same for all contexts. For example, in a recent paper, we not only looked at two independent variables, A and B, that potentially have been found in the literature to impact our dependent variable, because this would not be a major contribution to knowledge. But we compare the importance or the relative importance of both of them, and we found that one of them is more important than the other one. This would be a contribution. On top of that, we looked at a moderating variable that shows that this variable does not always impact the dependent variable, but only in some context. And we show this graphically. For example, here we can see that when the organizational climate, OC, is low, and organizational climate is defined below, it doesn't really matter if you develop a formal process, a project management process, in this particular paper, project management methodology for the front end of projects, because it doesn't make a difference on the dependent variable. But if the organizational climate is high, then the formal methodology, the templates, the procedures, together with an organization that supports from the top this type of behavior, the combination only then is relevant and impacts and enhances the value of the dependent variable. Finally, a few suggestions for reporting procedures when you write quantitative papers in project management. For example, in the methodology section, remember to describe the sample, the number of observation, whether the sample represents the population, describe the data collection procedures, how you reach the participants, what did you ask, and so on. Give us some background about this process and all the work that you have done. Define the construct and provide example of all the items that you use to measure each construct. Also, the items should be reported either as part of the result section if they are relevant, if not, as an appendix. Report the reliability and validity tests that you have conducted to ensure that the measures are correct, valid, and reliable, and describe the data analysis procedures, how you analyze the data, what softwares, what tests you've conducted, and so on. And finally, in the results section, report first on some descriptive statistics. For example, a correlation table between the main constructs, not the items, but the constructs will be very useful, and report the results in terms of the measurements that are quite common, beta values, R-squared, and so on, and tell us what the conclusion is in the results section about each hypothesis, whether it has been supported or not. That's all for today. Thank you very much for attending this presentation.